It's an unfortunate fact that most linguistic theory is based on a few major European languages, especially English. And this actually damages our understanding of how the thousands of languages in the world might work. But there is one man who has spent his career trying to correct that balance. Robert Van Valin is one of the developers of role and reference grammar, or RRG, a linguistic theory which aims to explain language by starting with some of the most unfamiliar languages in the world. In this interview, we talk about the fundamentals of RRG and what unites and divides the world's languages. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box, where you will also find a link to Robert's website. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, I think foreign language study in general is crucial, not because you learn to, as a practical matter, to talk to more people, but rather you learn that the world isn't as your language tells you. That it doesn't matter what the language is, you start learning it and you discover that the world isn't a preset inventory of entities that has different labels for different languages, but rather the entities themselves are different. And Edward Sapir, back in the 20s, wrote the truly liberating thing about linguistic study is that it liberates the mind from the tyranny of absolutes. Because monolingual people think that the world is as their language tells you. And once you start trying, you can take Spanish one, German one, French one, you encounter, when you try to translate something, you discover that it's not like just finding the other word for the same concept, but this word overlaps your concepts. And you have to realize that there are similarities between things that you never thought there were similarities before, and there are differences between things that you always thought were the same.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting places that this kind of appears is when you start to look at colors. And I know that that's a massive cliche in the world of linguistics to look at kind of color theory and cognition, but it is a great thing to look at because it's so kind of simple and so essential to the human experience.
You get into funny situations. I had a research project at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics a few years ago. We borrowed a video that had been made by a different project to study information structure in certain contexts. And it was a sort of a Lego movie with Mr. Green, Mr. Blue, and Mr. Red. And the four of us in the research group took the test out to test with the languages that we were working on. And all four of the languages that the group studied made no distinction between blue and green. They only had GRU, which is the term for it. So the speakers were watching this movie and trying to figure out how they were going to call Mr. Blue and Mr. Green because they had the same word for both. So it was, in European languages, you don't have this problem. And the thing was designed originally for a second language acquisition study on Turkish and German and Dutch and so on. And when we got out with Native American languages and Siberian languages and African languages and Austronesian languages, we ran into this problem over and over again that people didn't make this distinction.
So how did those speakers actually make the difference? Did they use sort of comparative phrases like this is the color of leaves and this is the color of water or something like that?
No, they said, we'll call this one Mr. Black and this one, Mr. Grew. Basically, they just picked black as for the darker color and called him Mr. Black to get around the problem. But it was kind of amusing to run into this issue.
I saw a replication recently, and I think it was maybe in cognition, and they proved that Berlin and Kay were mostly right about this. There being like foci for the different kind of colors.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the color was originally proposed as a test of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it always struck me as a funny test. I mean, what they're really about is not physical perception, but categorization. So we categorize two things as the same, and another language categorizes them as different. So, I mean, the example I give in class when I teach Saussure, who, by the way, was a radical relativist. He never gets brought up. Nobody says the Saussure's Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, but Saussure was I mean, he said there are no distinct ideas before the appearance of language. I mean, and the fact that the signifieds are arbitrary across languages is different concepts attached to different words and stuff. But I give the example of the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Missouri. In English, those are all rivers. In French, the Mississippi is a fleuve, but the Ohio and the Missouri are rivière because a fleuve flows into the ocean and a rivière flows into another river. So if you ask a French speaker, are the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri all the same thing? They would say no. One is a fleuve and the other two a rivière. And if you ask an English speaker, are these things the same? They'll say, yeah, of course, they're rivers.
So, because I know that some of your work has sort of dealt with this question of linguistic universals, or, especially related to, some of the ideas of universal grammar. I mean, what do you think is the state of the art as so far as linguistic universals?
I'm not a fan of Chomsky's view, which you're pretty clear on. One of the claims that RRG makes is that the more semantically motivated something is, the less cross-linguistic variation there will be. And the less semantically motivated something is, the more cross-linguistic motivation there will be. So to take an example, if you think of the problem of determining the proper conditions on the interpretation of a reflexive pronoun. So John saw himself. John talked to Mary about himself. John talked to Mary about herself. There's two issues in the analysis of reflexives. One is, what's the relationship between the antecedent and the reflexive? So basically, in most theories, it's the antecedent is higher in the tree than the reflexive. Now, I define that semantically. That is, actors bind undergoers, agents bind patients, not the other way around. That there's a semantic, and that's universally. There aren't any exceptions of cases of objects binding subjects or patients binding agents. The other issue is, how far away can the reflexive be from the antecedent? And English is very conservative. You can say John hurt himself, but you can't say John told Mary to help himself. okay, which is perfect in Icelandic. In Icelandic, you can do that. And in Japanese, you can do that and have even the reflexive even farther away. So the question of how far away the reflexive is from the antecedent is not a semantic issue. It's a syntactic issue, and languages vary dramatically along that dimension. But on the other dimension, they're very consistent. The more agent-like argument binds the more patient-like argument, and not vice versa. So the semantically motivated part is basically universal. The non-semantically motivated part varies dramatically.
Yeah, and I mean this because we haven't really spoken specifically about, you know, what exactly role and reference grammar is, but in your PDF explanation, there's this great little kind of diagram which I think is the visual representation of what RRG is. So but the core of it, right, is this link between syntax and semantics.
Right.
And like I'm curious about, you know, could you sort of explain what RRG is, you know, in kind of in layman's terms, like compared to other types of grammar?
RRG differs from other theories of grammar in a number of ways. One is the general perspective that it takes on language, and most theories start out from a set of a language or languages that the developer of the theory is familiar with. Okay, and so most linguistic theories that are discussed in the Western Europe, Britain, US, and so on, started from Indo-European languages or started more or less from English. And the basic ideas were developed with respect to familiar languages, and then you try to extend them to more exotic languages. And RRG turned that on its head. So when Bill Foley and I were graduate students at Berkeley, I was studying Lakota, which is the language of the Sioux Indians. Bill was studying Tagalog, which is the national language of the Philippines, and we'd read Bob Dixon's Grammar of Dearball, which is an Australian Aboriginal language. And we asked the question, what would linguistic theory look like if we started from Lakota, Tagalog, and Dearball rather than English? So rather than start with the familiar and work to the exotic, we'd start with the exotic and work back to the familiar. And when you do that, the familiar doesn't look so familiar anymore. And you discover that most of the categories that theories operate with don't necessarily hold for these other language types. So it gives you a new perspective on familiar languages. So that was one thing. So that's why, like, the theory of clause structure in RRG, the theory of grammatical relations, is all different from other theories, is because we started from these rather different grammatical systems. The other thing is that we were committed to the idea that, and this is, RRG started out as a theory of grammatical relations, and the role and the reference were taken from a paper by Paul Schachter from 1977 called Role-Related and Reference-Related Properties of Subjects. And I was writing a paper, and I thought I should give a name to this stuff that Bill and I were doing. And so I borrowed Schachter's terms, and that's where role and reference grammar comes in. Is the idea that you've got semantic roles on the one hand and pragmatics, discourse pragmatics, which is the reference, on the other, and that you get an interaction between these two in the constitution of grammatical relations in different languages, and you get a different mix. So the grammaticalization is not the interaction of discourse pragmatics and semantics is different in different languages, and this underlies the differences in grammatical systems.
That sort of brings me to ask, because I know that there's this sort of questioning, maybe not just in the field of linguistics but in the field of science in general, that a lot of science is based on weird people, right? So that's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I think it's really interesting that you sort of looked at the way that language was studied, which was, as you say, like trying to compare all other languages to Latin or Greek or whatever. And you said, well, no, how about if we start with something weird? And like, do you think that this has had a really negative effect on maybe the study of language in the past, 50 or 100 years?
You mean this taking Indo-European as a starting point?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think it's led to a particular point of view. So, and this is something that linguists like Franz Boas talked about way back in 1911, that languages don't necessarily, the categories you find in languages, there are categories that we think are essential, like tense, which are missing in other languages. And the other languages have categories that aren't part of Indo-European languages. So when you start from Indo-European, you are, in a sense, committing yourself to a set of categories that may not work cross-linguistically. I mean, we talked about sort of Worfian effects. Well, I think there's Worfian effects on linguistic theory, in that it's hard to imagine a Russian speaker, a Slavic speaker, coming up with a theory based on rigid phrase structure. And it's equally difficult to imagine that an English speaker would come up with a theory of communicative dynamism like the Czechs did. I mean, those theories reflect properties of the native language of the theoretician.
But role and reference grammar can account for variation in all languages.
We try. I mean, again, to go back to the thing I said earlier about the more semantically motivated something is, the less cross-linguistic variation. The basic pieces of clause structure in RRG, the nucleus, the core, the clause, those are semantically motivated constructs, and they're universal, even though they may be realized by an independent verb with independent noun phrases, or a verb carrying pronominal markers, like an American Indian language, for example, or a Bantu language. The same fundamental distinctions are there. They're just realized morphosyntactically in different ways.
I mean, would it be unfair if I sort of look at this diagram where I see this link between kind of syntax and semantics? I mean, would it be fair to simplify that even further and say that it's almost the relationship between thought and words?
The idea of the linking algorithm, it's supposed to represent in an idealized form what you and I are doing when we use language. So I'm as a speaker, I'm formulating messages, coming up with the semantic representation of those messages, mapping that into the syntax and uttering it. So that's semantics to syntax linking. You, as the hearer, are parsing what I'm saying, giving rise to a syntactic structure, which you then map into a semantic structure, which gives you the meaning of my utterance. So the linking from semantics to syntax and syntax to semantics is meant to be an idealization of what speakers and hearers do.
I know that you've looked a little bit at aphasic participants, a little bit, right? Do you know anything about why it is that people can have this kind of passive, so much passive language? So you could say they have what, passive semantics, but yet they might have a lot of difficulty converting that into syntax.
I mean, the research that we did back in the 80s and early 90s on aphasia showed a number of things. One was that this area, anterior Brodmann's area 22, which is the part of the temporal lobe before auditory cortex, was involved in syntactic processing and seemed to have, was also involved in the processing of music, which both involve complex structural relationships. The thing that I found most intriguing about the fact that damage, I mean, we had patients who had Broca's area damage and no anterior 22 damage, and they didn't have very severe impairments, but if they had anterior 22 damage and no Broca's damage, it was much worse. It was much, their impairment was much worse. What I find intriguing is the following. Brodmann's areas are defined in terms of cell architecture. So a given Brodmann's area means you've got a part of the brain where the cells all have the same structure. And anterior 22 is, like I said, before primary auditory cortex. Posterior 22, which has the same cell architecture, is better known as Wernicke's area, which is where involved in semantics and understanding. So the same cell architecture processes syntax and semantics, which I find a very appealing fact.
So there's some kind of there's a deep connection there.
Yeah, exactly. You've got the same kind of brain cells processing syntax and semantics, which is very amenable to my view of the world.
Well, I know that another part of role and reference grammar, because I have another page from your kind of your PDF, which talks about the 6 different classes. So you have states, activities, semilfactives, achievements, accomplishments, and active accomplishments, and these are a core part of RRG. Is that right?
These are called Aktionsart distinctions, and Aktionsart is just a German word, means form of action. And they were originally proposed by a philosopher named Zeno Wendler. On the basis of English data, he proposed the distinction between states, activities, achievements, which were punctual changes of state, like shatter or explode, and accomplishments, which were non-punctual changes of state. So melt, freeze, recover from illness. And we another linguist by the name of David Dowdy proposed a formalization of Wendler's distinctions, which we used as the basis for our lexical representation. Because one of the things that we wanted to have was a semantic representation that actually represented some of the semantics. I know that sounds kind of funny, but most theories operate with a very minimal semantic representation, and we wanted something more substantive. And so we adopted Dowdy's decompositional reinterpretation of Wendler, and basically after 15 years, I went back to Wendler, and the result is the system you describe. Took Wendler's categories, added simulfactives, which had been argued for by a linguist from the University of Texas, and active accomplishments, which is an RRG notion. And then came up with the current scheme, and it's the starting point for an RRG analysis of a language. The first thing you have to do when you're approaching a language from an RRG point of view is work out the verb classes, because that semantic representation is going to be the input to the linking, and a lot of phenomena are handled in the semantics in RRG, because basically the RRG point of view is that semantics drives grammar. And so having a substantive semantic representation with principles that, how shall I say, it's a principled representation. There are tests that tell you something's an activity, something's a state, something's an achievement. And that tells you that this is what the representation for this verb in this sentence has to be. It's not just up to the whim of the analyst.
Knowing what you know about the way that languages work, especially from an RRG perspective, if you were going to learn a language, how would you approach it?
Well, I mean, being a linguini, I would approach it. I probably would approach it, like I would if I were analyzing it. Start with the verb semantics and work my way up to discourse. But that's not very practical. That's not a very practical approach. But it would give me both an analysis and some speaking competence. If there's a larger question of what could RRG do for language teaching, I suspect that the fact that many phenomena are explained in semantic terms rather than in abstract syntactic terms is something that can be paraphrased for non-specialists to appreciate. Like the thing I said about reflexive binding, the doer binds the done to, basically. You could put it in those terms and you would always get the right result. I mean, I don't know how difficult it is to teach people reflexive pronouns, but
Well, I mean, I think it depends on their kind of native language, because, like, for example, for an English speaker to look at Spanish reflexive verbs, for example, I mean, I know they're not pronouns, but, well, they sort of are, but, that's to an English speaker, it's kind of a bit weird because we don't have reflexive verbs that work in the same way.
No, not at all.
So being able to abstract the concept and say, well, it's about binding, I think that could definitely be useful in the classroom.
Yeah, well, the Romance reflexives are um, an interesting topic. There's been a lot of written about them, and I have a syntax text that I published in 1997 together with Randy Lapola. We've got an extensive analysis of Romance and Slavic, which run pretty much in parallel, reflexive. And the thing that is so interesting is that most uses of the so-called reflexive aren't reflexive. They're either obligatory with the verb, or they take a transitive verb and make it intransitive. And you get, this example that I used to talk about was se me rompió la taza, which can mean I broke my cup broke on me, I accidentally broke the cup. The same string of words has a whole bunch of different interpretations, and none of them are reflexive. I mean, it's either I'm the possessor of the cup, or the cup broke on me.
Yeah, and well, as an English person learning Spanish, people say the sort of general explanation for reflexive verbs in Spanish is that it's basically, if you can substitute self, then it's a reflexive verb. And I'm like, well, no, not really, because there are plenty of verbs where the self is doing something, but they're not reflexive. And that, this logic doesn't really, as you say, it doesn't really apply.
No, I've always objected to people saying the door opens itself. I mean, that's not what it means. Actually, I've claimed that calling it reflexive morphology is a misnomer, because that's one of the uses of it, and that's perhaps salient, but there's a much wider range of uses, and most of which aren't really reflexive, that they involve operations on the argument structure of the verb. So when you get impersonal C constructions, there's nothing reflexive about, say, habla español.
The Spanish speaks itself.
Right, exactly. That's not what it means.
You've devoted, most of your life and all of your professional career to studying languages, and I'm wondering why you think that language is important.
I mean, I hate to sound like something totally banal, but gosh, it's the thing that makes us human. I mean, language is so crucial for all aspects of human life. I mean, from cognition to social interaction, that it's hard to imagine human existence without language. That's kind of part of Dan's argument about language and Homo erectus. They had such a level of reached a level of complexity in sort of social organization and technology and related things, that it's just difficult to imagine this could be possible without language.